Good afternoon. Hello. Hi, everybody. I'm here. Sorry if you missed me yesterday. I had many futile attempts at trying to post while I was on the mainland. I just don't have the tools for that. I just don't. I don't have a YouTube channel that will let me upload from a mobile device because I need 1,000 followers to do that. That's not happening. Um, I I don't have any Apple devices. My phone ran out of charge. My phone is old. It has no room to upload files or videos or any of that. So it was, I tried. There was attempts there. There were a few attempts, and I might, do a little posting of some of the videos that I attempted because I read something. I was recording something, trying to get out to you that I really like that I'm not reading today. But anyway, that's about yesterday, and here we are today. So today is Friday, August 7th. It is, Friday in August. I live in a tourist town. Sort of interesting around here. The combination, I think, this is a personal viewpoint, the combination of the threat of a storm and the changing of quarantining after you have visited Rhode Island. You now have to quarantine for 2 weeks if you come to Rhode Island longer than 24 hours. The combination of those two things has really put a little bit of a damper on Block Island. I'm not going to say it's like done, but I keep looking at the windows as if I can see, but I'm on the second floor. I can't see. But it's been quiet. We'll see what happens this weekend. It may not continue to be quiet. It may change in an instant, but it's a little quiet right now. So this is Frankenstein Tea. This is a daily program. I'm going to call it a daily program, even though I missed yesterday. I very rarely miss. Very, very rarely have I missed. And its intention is to bring short stories to you, the listener, and a little bit about the library and what we're doing here at the library to you, our patrons, and for you to stay connected to us in that way. And we'll continue to do that. This COVID climate, the COVID climate, is not changing. Well, it's changing, right? But it's not changing towards being fixed or for the better anytime soon. And so, well, I don't know. Maybe it's being changed for the better, but you know what I'm saying. It still lurks. COVID still lurks. We're still dealing with COVID. And so we will continue to our virtual programs. Miss Morgan does programs virtually. I do this program every day at 3. This is a short story program for adult listeners. And we have a few things in the works, some other fun programs to add to our YouTube channel. So this is Frankenstein Tea, adult stories for adult listeners. I've been doing it for quite some time. This today is the 100th episode on our YouTube channel. You know, that's a mark. That's a marker for sure. That's a marking. And I'm going to mark it with something a little random, something that I just found, an author I do not know, stories that I just read this past 45 minutes. I just read through 3 or 4 of them. I'm going to pick one and read it. It's not a Hemingway or Truman Capote or Isabel Allende. It's a little bit random, and I like them. So I'm going to read one today. I'm going to read from Theodora Goss. Theodora Goss. Her book is In the Forest of Forgetting. Theodora Goss, In the Forest of Forgetting. And it was published by Prime Books, and it was published in 2006. And it's in our science fiction collection. And that's because we lump sci-fi with fantasy. This is not really science fiction. These are fantasy stories. Again, a genre that I would not necessarily go to on my own, but in this program of Frankenstein Tea, I've tried to expand genres and what we're looking at and what we're listening to and the stories that we're telling. So this is an expansion for me, maybe for you as a listener, into fantasy. I'm going to read, I think, as I said, I just read a few and I liked them, but I can always come back. I can always come back. But for today, I'm going to read the title story, which is In the Forest of Forgetting. She stood at the edge of the forest. She knew it was the edge because behind her the path disappeared into undergrowth. She could see rhododendrons covered with flowers like cotton candy. There were bushes with flowers which she could not name. Shrubus leafiana. Ahead of her, the path was shaded by oaks, poplars, maples with leaves like Canadian flags. In the shadow of the trees, the air was cool and smelled of toothpaste. "Welcome," said the witch. She was standing beneath an oak tree whose branches were covered with green acorns. The witch was wearing a white coat. Around her neck was a silver chain with a silver disc hanging from it. Just what a witch should look like, she thought. It was comforting when things looked as they should. The forest, for instance. "Where am I?" she asked. "In the forest of forgetting," said the witch. "Hence the forgetting. Let me check your heart." "Why am I here?" The witch placed the silver disc on her chest. It felt cold against her bare skin. "Heart normal. You're here because you have lumps." She looked down at her chest where the silver disc had been placed. There they were, the only lumps she could see, above the slight bulge of her stomach. What's wrong with them? They were small and a bit crooked, but they looked all right. The witch put her hands in her pockets. "Your lumps have metastasized. They must be removed." "Well," she said, and again, "Well." Even in the stillness under the trees, which made her feel calm and a bit sleepy, this seemed unnecessarily repetitive. "How?" "With this," said the witch, pulling a silver wand from one pocket. It looked harmless enough. The witch muttered something under her breath and waved her wand. Before she had time to close her eyes or prepare herself for whatever might happen, 2 moths rose from her chest, white with flecks of gray on their wings. They fluttered along the path, looping and twisting around one another as though making invisible macrame. She looked down at her chest. The lumps were gone. "That went quite well," said the witch, replacing the wand in her pocket. The moths fluttered upward, spiraling into the treetops until she could no longer see them. The clouds overhead were white and fluffy like sheep. "No," she thought, "like pillows, like unrolled toilet paper left in heaps on the floor." She liked creating unusual similes. "Don't go too far into the forest," said the witch. "You'll have to come back eventually." The witch began walking toward the rhododendrons and nameless bushes. "Wait," she said. Something had been bothering her. She had almost forgotten it, watching the moths rise upward. "What is my name?" The witch turned back for a moment. Her silver disc winked in the shifting light under the trees. "Your name is Patient." She looked down at the path. Her feet were bare and her toenails needed clipping. That didn't sound right at all. She wasn't particularly patient, was in fact generally impatient. She looked up, wanting to ask the witch if she was certain, but the witch was gone. There was nothing to do but go farther into the forest. It was silent, except for the occasional rustle high among the treetops. When she heard laughter, she looked up. In the branches of a laurel, spiders had woven their webs, like a giant game of cat's cradle. They were brown and about the size of her hand. What sort of web? What web? What web? The words came down to her in clacking sing-song, as though she were being questioned by a collection of sewing machines. One spider spun itself down from a branch and hung by its thread in front of her. What web? It went into paroxysms of laughter, shaking on its thread like a brown yo-yo. She looked around her, trying to see what the spiders were laughing about, and saw that the path behind her was littered with brown string. She knelt down, picked up a handful, and suddenly realized what she was holding. Not a web, she said to the spiders. My hair. See? She put her hand on her head. It was bare. Her arms and legs were bare. Even the place under her belly was bare. It's fallen out. I won't have to buy shampoo or disposable razors. She said this to show it was probably for the best. Perhaps they believed her, because their laughter stopped and the dangling spider rose again to its branch. But she sat on the path and cried, wiping her eyes with a handful of hair. When she was finished, she blew her nose on an oak leaf and went on. It was no use, she told herself, crying over spilt hair. Perhaps she would grow a winter coat. Perhaps it would come in white, like an Arctic's hares. Like an Arctic hares. She was so focused on planning for winter when her coat would come in and she would live on acorns that she almost tripped over the coffin. Be careful, said the first apprentice. He was dressed in a blue coat and wore a blue shower cap on his head. Around his neck was a silver chain with a silver disc hanging from it. You'll trip over the queen, said the second apprentice, who was dressed just like him. If you tripped, she would blame us, said the third apprentice. Her shower cap was pushed back to show her bangs. Who? She asked. The queen? The queen looked incapable of blaming anybody. The witch! We're her apprentices, said the apprentices together. Obviously, muttered the third apprentice. She wondered if they had practiced beforehand. Let us check your heart, said the first apprentice. All three came together and pulled their silver discs on her chest, and put their silver discs on her chest. Heart normal. Too slow. Too fast. They glared at each other and began arguing among themselves. She looked down at the queen. The glass of the coffin was perfectly clear. Through it, she could see the queen's robe, a deep blue, and her blue turban. Her face was a little blue as well. She died of lumps, said the apprentices. They metastasized. The witch could not remove them in time. Magic is much more advanced nowadays. She put her hands on the coffin and, not knowing what else to do, tapped her fingers on the glass. Her cuticles were ragged. What would the queen think? She left you gifts, said the apprentices. A dress. It was made of paper and tied in back. She could not reach the strings, so the first apprentice tied it for her. She had never liked floral patterns, she thought, looking down at herself. but it would have to do until her winter coat came in. A mirror, the second apprentice held it for her. She realized with surprise that she had no eyebrows. She would have expected that. It made her look surprised, which seemed appropriate. The third apprentice smiled and said, "You look a little like her, only not so blue." She did, indeed, look a little like the queen. "Thank you," she said. The queen approved of politeness. "Did she, by any chance, leave me a name?" She did not want to seem ungrateful, but this was, after all, important to her. You needed a name. If someone was going to, for example, ask you to lunch. She had not eaten since breakfast, and she was beginning to feel hungry. "Your name is Daughter," they said. "Now it's time to turn back." Why? Surely she was too old for a name like Daughter. They looked at each other, then muttered among themselves. "Because," they said decisively. She frowned, wondering what it looked like without eyebrows, wondering if she should look in the mirror again to find out. Instead, she turned and walked farther along the path, deeper into the forest. "Wait!" they shouted behind her. "You're going too far. Your heart can't take it. Do you want to end up like the queen?" Eventually, it was silent again. The forest began to grow darker. Maples and poplars were replaced by pines. Needles prickled her feet as she walked on the path. She tried to eat a pine cone, but it left her hands sticky and tasted like gasoline. Not that she had tasted gasoline, but she imagined it would taste exactly like that. If she could wash her hands in the river, "No one may cross the river," said the knight. "I don't want to cross. I just want to wash my hands and have a drink." "No," said the knight. Above the knees, he was dressed in a suit of armor. Below, he wore a pair of galoshes. "Oye ame atne itre ore ashwe one one way." He lifted his visor. His mustache looked like it had been cut with nail clippers. It was turning gray. Why? It was the question she had been asking since she entered the forest. The knight looked puzzled. "I don't know. I think it's a rule or something." He had a nice voice. The witch and her apprentices had sounded like subway conductors, and the queen hadn't spoken at all. "I think you're supposed to go back." "That's just it," she said. "Who is you? I mean, who is me?" She sounded impatient, and she realized that she must be hungry, tired, impatient. No one in this forest answered questions directly. Would anyone tell her what she wanted to know? "Well," he said. He tugged at his mustache, although his armored hands were clumsy. "You like blackberry pie. You overwater houseplants, feed stray cats on the back porch, sleep through your alarm clock." He began counting on his fingers. It must help him remember, she thought. "You write stories for children, A Camembert Moon, Priscilla's Flying Pig, The Train to Nowhereton. You complain about your knees and you hate wearing glasses. Once you went on a diet where you ate nothing but cucumbers for a week. You can't mend socks, play tennis, or sing. You hate scrubbing toilets." He reached 10 and looked at her, fingers outspread. "How am I doing?" "Well," she said. She did like blackberry pie, although she didn't need glasses. Her eyesight was perfectly clear. She could see, for instance, that the knight had wrinkles under his eyes. They made him look rather handsome. "But what is my name?" "I think," said the knight, looking at his fingers as though trying to remember, "I think Your name is wife. It was a nice name, whispery, like wish, and Winnie, and Willow. It was the nicest name she had heard so far, but it wasn't quite right. I'm sorry, she said, because the knight was looking at her with an anxious smile. She stepped into the river. Wait, said the knight. The river was cold and clear and shallow. Although there were stepping stones, she walked on the muddy bottom, letting the water curl around her ankles, then around her knees. In the middle of the river, she bent down to wash her hands and frightened a brown fish under a rock. Once her hands were no longer sticky, she drank from them and splashed water on her face, scattering drops of water on her paper dress. Won't you reconsider? Shouted the knight. He was standing in the water up to the buckles of his galoshes. She wondered if he would follow her into the river, but he did not. Perhaps, she thought, he was afraid that his armor would rust. Instead, he stood near the riverbank, arms held out like an airplane. He was standing there each time she turned back to look. Finally, the path bent, and she could no longer see him. Once, a family of squirrels scrambled down from an oak tree and asked for her autograph. The squirrel children had copies of A Camembert Moon. When she told them she had no pen, they brought her berries. She signed each one, with regards, author. She wondered where they kept books, where there were shelves in the oak tree. When she had signed copies for Jumpy, Squirmy, Tailless, Nut Hunter, and Squawk, they shared their dinner with her, an acorn mash that would have made a good meal if she had been a squirrel. She was still hungry, although less hungry than before. Finally, the trees grew farther apart. She saw undergrowth, including a bush with berries. They looked like the berries the squirrels had used for ink. She wondered if they were safe to eat and thought of trying a few. Surely, if they were poisonous, she would feel sick or throw up. A few would not kill her, but she was too nervous to try. The trees ended at the edge of a meadow filled with Queen Anne's lace, poppies, cornflowers, and beyond the meadow. Are you going to the mountains? Asked the princess. She wore pajamas with feet and a necklace of paper clips. Was she? They were blue with pines and probably farther away than they appeared. Look at what I have, said the princess. She was holding a wicker cage. In it were two moths, white with gray markings on their wings. I wondered where they had gone, she said. She was sorry now to have lost them. They were pretty, like sheets of newspaper turned into kites. I'll give them water in the teacups my dolls use. Do you know my dolls? No, she said. It was an important question. Was she going to the mountains? Their names are Octavia, because she only has 8 toes, and Puddle, because, you know. The princess raised her hand to her mouth as though speaking through a trumpet. She's just a baby. Do you like making dresses for your dolls? She asked the princess. Yes, said the princess. I make them from leaves and toilet paper. If you help me untie it, she said, you can have my dress. It had been itching for some time, and anyway, she would not need it in the mountains. When the strings were untied, she slipped the dress off and handed it to the princess. Someone was moving in the meadow, someone in a blue coat with a blue shower cap on his head. He was holding an enormous butterfly net, and another someone, and another. We'll catch her, shouted the apprentices, jumping and turning as though chasing enormous butterflies. She shouldn't have crossed the river. Her heart can't take the strain. But we'll catch her here, never worry. Had she made her final decision? Was she going to the mountains? The apprentices began stalking away from each other like detectives. "You're good at names, aren't you?" she said to the princess. The princess nodded. "I once named 17 caterpillars. They were named 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, up to 17. What would you name me?" Every few minutes, one apprentice would run up to another, shouting, "Boo!" and making the other jump. The mountains looked mysterious and inviting. The princess considered. "I think I would name you Mother." An excellent name, but not her name. Not quite. She would find her name in the mountains. It would be unexpected and inevitable, a name she could never have imagined, like Rumpelstiltskin. In the mountains, she would learn about berries. Her winter coat would come in. She leaned down and kissed the princess, then put one hand on the wicker cage. "Goodbye," she said. "Take good care of them. I think they once belonged to the queen." She stepped into the sunlight. It was warm on her body. Bees circled around her, visiting the Queen Anne's lace. The apprentices were stalking away from each other, butterfly nets raised and fluttering in the breeze. She hoped they would not notice her. She held out her hands so they brushed the tops of the grasses and started across the meadow. From the Sci-Fi Fantasy Collection. This is a fantasy writer. I'll read to you her page on her book jacket here. World Fantasy Award nominated author Theodora Goss was born in Hungary and lived in Italy and Belgium before her family moved to the United States. Her stories often take place on the border between fantasy and reality and reflect the influence of an Eastern European literary tradition that incorporates fantastic elements into otherwise realistic works. Theodora lives in Boston with her husband Kendrick and their daughter Ophelia in an apartment filled with books and cats. She gets really, as I said, I read a few. A few of these get really fairy tale-like. I liked them, adult fairy tales. We'll come back to Theodora Goss there. For today, thanks for coming to the 100th YouTube episode of Frankenstein Tea. We're going forward tomorrow. My father is texting me that he's going north. Safe travels, Poppy. Okay, everybody. I'll see you tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Have a great afternoon. Bye. Peace.